Okay, welcome. Today we're going to be talking about globalization and the liberal state. And the great question we have in this presentation is, does trade have a telos? I know you're all probably tired of hearing the word telos by now, but it's one we'll probably never get away from. So, let's begin. We're going to, whoops, begin if I can get it turned on. Here we go. There. All right. So, we're going to be looking at the history of globalization and the liberal state. And we'll find that they're tied together. They both grow together. So we'll talk about some current issues to begin with, and then we'll deal with the first globalized commodity, cotton. Then we'll talk about the liberal state, and we'll talk about the post-war period. Let's start with some current issues. All right, let's talk about the rise of global inequality. Now, the truth of the matter is, whatever else you might hear about free trade, the truth is that rich countries impose terms on the poorer countries. Okay? Poor nations are confined to providing raw materials, but the processing of those raw materials is left to richer states. Of course, it's in the processing that the real value added comes, and so that's where the real wealth is created. In many countries, all of the major assets are owned by foreigners. So look at Africa, for example. If you'll notice on this map, you'll find the major sources of wealth in Africa are all owned by foreign companies, primarily American and European countries, and increasingly Chinese countries. Furthermore, they have control of finance, distribution, processing. So the wealth that is produced in the country is simply shipped out. There's this growing rich-poor divide. Wealth is more and more flowing to the top. So I think we've seen this chart before, but this is the amount of income that goes to the top 10%. And we have returned to pre-war levels in income inequality. Labor has lost its bargaining power, and it's lost its rights. And so you have more of the gig economy, people working as contractors. And this produces great social and political pressures. So we have a loss of confidence in institutions. It doesn't matter what the institution is today, it's surrounded by doubters, and probably with good cause. So whether it's the CDC or the Congress or the presidency or the World Health Organization, it doesn't matter. People are simply losing confidence in them. And there's a suspicion of all leaders. We have constant local wars. And these wars are often proxy wars for the great powers. There's a complete loss of political dialogue. And with it, a loss of social cohesion, and we might call that social capital. And this social capital is prior to everything else. Along with that, we have the rise of populism and nationalism. And if you remember from Fratelli Tutti, this is exactly what the Pope was talking about. There's a rejection of globalism and a turn to populist leaders who might be labeled, I think, reasonably as demagogues. So we hear this in country after country. Make Hungary, Poland, the United States, Brazil, whatever it might be, great again. Some form of that kind of rhetoric. This highly nationalistic, this highly us against them sort of rhetoric. Is this situation sustainable? Or is it a recipe for war? And is there an alternative to liberal globalism? Well, I think to understand globalism, we have to understand its origins. And it originated with a very particular commodity and the establishment of the Empire of Cotton. So we'll talk about the first global commodity. We'll talk about colonial capitalism. We'll talk about industrial capitalism and finance, and then finally retail capitalism. All right. So these are the factories in Manchester in the 19th century. See how lovely it looks? But even uglier than that is this. So these are young girls working in the cotton mill. Is that what you'd like for your daughter? You'll notice not only are they wearing rags and are barefoot, but you'll notice the whole factory floor there is covered with cotton fibers. Well, these girls are breathing in those fibers because it's all throughout the air. And they will all have severe pulmonary problems throughout their adult lives. Let's talk about cotton, a very versatile fabric, one that is easily grown in warm climates. But its processing cotton is very labor intensive. Nevertheless, it uses simple tools and machines, so it can be done at home, and typically was. But it takes dyes very easily, so cotton is very, very colorful, makes very, very colorful cloth. Now, it was unknown in Europe. It came into Europe with the trade with the Arabs. So Europeans were wearing linens and woolens, which are much duller than cotton. And production was mostly for home use or for local and regional markets. It was part of subsistence farming and local industry. Now, the pre-industrial history of cotton is tied to subsistence farming. We think of subsistence farming as poverty, but in fact, what it meant was independence and self-reliance. Cotton was interplanted with food crops, usually just enough to meet a family's needs, or perhaps a little extra as a cash crop. Most cotton was processed within a few miles of where it was grown, and processed for local and regional markets. It was mostly point-to-point trade. And there was an extensive amount of putting out networks. That is, instead of perhaps having a factory where the yarn was spun or where the cloth was made, people would just take on that job in their homes, in their spare time. Matter of fact, the term spinster comes from having an unmarried aunt or a member of the family, and her job was mainly to spin yarn. And that's how she earned her place in the family. So, and an unmarried woman became known as a spinster. Then comes technology. The first big improvement in the modern era was the Flying Shuttle, 1733. This is a very, very simple device. So with cotton, in weaving of cotton, so you have to reach over and throw the shuttle across the whoop and the wharf threads. Then you have to reverse the threads, reach over, and throw the shuttle again. Well, that meant that made it a very, very physically tiring job. And it also meant that the cloth could be really no wider than a man's reach. Well, the flying shuttle was just a simple device of attaching sort of a hammer and a box to each end so you could kick the shuttle back and forth by pulling on this handle. This greatly speeded up weaving. They could weave much, much faster now, which means that the spinsters had trouble keeping up with the weavers. Well, this problem was solved by the spinning jenny in 1760. So instead of having the wheel attached to one spindle, you had it attached to multiple spindles, 5, 10, maybe even 15 spindles. All right. Well, then the spinning jenny was attached to a water mill, and you got the Arkwright water frame in 1769. Now the spinning of yarn could be moved into a factory. Well, this was a good deal for the weavers because now they had a lot more yarn to work with. However, then they got caught up in automation with Cartwright's power loom in 1785. So it starts out as a relatively simple device, but now you don't need the weaver. You just need somebody to turn that handle. But they soon become very, very complex machines. However, they do need constant tending. Well, the result was that English yarn and fabric was now the cheapest in the world. Now, this is very odd because England obviously does not grow any cotton, but nevertheless had the cheapest cotton products. However, technology was not decisive in this process. What was? Creating a labor force. A wage labor force had to be created and disciplined to work at the pace of the machinery. This started with the enclosure movement. So all the small farms were dependent upon common lands. When these common lands became enclosed and passed from communal property into private property, then the position of the small farms became very precarious. Then there was a series of vagrancy laws. Vagrancy laws make it illegal to not have a job. So if you weren't working, then you were that was criminal. You could be and were put into jail. Unions and all public gatherings were outlawed. So throughout the 19th century, there's practically a low level of civil war going on in England and frequently in the United States as well. Adam Smith also remarks on this and the outlawing of unions which prevent the workers from bargaining for a fair wage. And then you had mandatory labor contracts with penal enforcement, like the Masters and Servants Act of 1823. Well, what did that mean? Well, that means if you signed a labor contract, if you were hired, you had to sign a labor contract, and you could not quit. So if you signed a contract for a year, you just couldn't say, well, this job stinks, and walk off. You were bound to work for that full year, and if not, you could be put in jail. And then poverty itself was criminalized with the workhouse in 1834. So England's welfare system was ended and replaced with the workhouse, which was basically a prison for paupers. Families were split apart, men in one dorm, women in another, children in another dorm. And you had to work from the age of 4 years old up. And the food could be no better than that afforded by the lowest prevailing wage. So the working class was in fact a creation of the state. It is not something natural. The system originally depended upon child labor. Women were paid half of what men were paid, and children were paid half of what women were paid. But the bigger advantage was that they were easily exploited. I mean, who's going to take a child's word against yours? And they were exploited, well, in not only physically, but not only as workers, but they were exploited in ways that we would consider sexual exploitation. But this changed the whole nature of childhood and the family. And of course, children always worked, but they worked in the home setting. They worked in the craft shop or they worked on the family farm. Okay? Working in the factory is entirely something different. The center of this was Manchester, England. Why Manchester? Well, because Manchester was the home of the slave and the sugar trade. So you had this three-part trade, bringing slaves from Africa to the East Indies and bringing sugar from the East Indies back to England. And it was this position in the triangular trade, as it was called, upon which Manchester was able to build its central position in the cotton trade. So for the first time in history, you have this highly globalized market where the product of Indian weavers paid for slaves in America to produce material for English weavers for world markets. There'd never been anything like that before. All of this was coordinated by merchants and bankers in Manchester. Now, it goes through a series of stages. It starts with colonial capitalism, moves on to industrial capitalism, then finance capitalism, and finally retail capitalism. Now, all of these are present at the same time in each phase. The question is which one has the leadership role. So, let's start with the first phase, colonial capitalism. All right. Now up here, I've taken this ship. This is may surprise you to learn that this is a merchant ship. But notice how well armed it is. Okay? This was not primarily for protection against pirates. It was because the merchants also came as conquerors. And this is the base of the whole system. American slavery became the foundation of this whole global market. So everything rested on the shoulders of the men, women, and children you see in this picture. Let's start with the conquest of India, because that's where it really begins. Manchester was running out of cotton. And of course, the East India Company traded in that. They came to India, which was very important in the cotton trade. They came as conquerors, not as traders, hence the armed merchantman. Now, this began in the 17th century. By the 18th century, the company, the East India Company, rules India. It's important to understand what happened there. England did not conquer India. The East India Company conquered India. It had its own private army, although it relied on the Royal Navy. It minted its own coins. It had its own flag, which, by the way, was the foundation for the American flag. And it was the company that controlled India. India didn't become part of the British Empire until 1860. Now, the company set prices for weavers, and they destroyed all the older market arrangements that had been around for 1,000 years at least. And under these new arrangements, the weaver's share of the price fell from 33% to 6%. Well, the state was heavily involved in this process. They forged and protected global markets. So that was the job. That's why the Royal Navy grew so fast in the 19th century. They forged fiscal tools to tax populations. So a couple of examples. In India, village property tended to be owned communally, with personal property that families used, but it still belonged to the community. England forced all of that to become private property because it was simply easier to tax private property. In Africa, they used the hut tax. The purpose of the hut tax was not to raise funds, but to force the natives into needing something that they had never needed before. Little bits of metal embossed with a bust of Queen Victoria. And the only way to get these little bits of metal was to work on the plantations or the mines or the factories of the Europeans. The state was necessary to build the vast infrastructures that this trade required. So the ports, for example, the railroads, the highways, these were all the responsibility of the state, and capitalism couldn't grow without it. And of course, the legal environment, and primarily the legal environment involving property, as we've just seen both in Africa and India, but also, of course, the enclosure movements in England. And of course, trade protectionism. Even though they all claimed to be free traders, they meant other countries should have free trade while they should maintain their tariffs. Well, England should maintain its tariffs. Okay. And as we've seen, the creation of labor markets and the disciplining of labor. And of course, military and fiscal power. The ability to project power across the globe. Military power, certainly, but also the control of finance and banking. All right, the whole system was built on American slavery because India simply could not supply all the cotton that was necessary. But in America, you had vast seizures of land from the Indians. And slavery provided the workforce. So a very docile workforce, unable to strike or demand anything at all for itself. The planters had unlimited political power in the South. As a matter of fact, the poor couldn't even vote. There was a property requirement to vote. Further, slaves could be used as collateral for loans. So having slaves gave you the borrowing power to get more land, to get more slaves. The American South became the most important supplier of the world's most important commodity. Now, do you think that might have played into the Civil War? Do you think the South thought that perhaps England had no choice but to come to her aid? That's exactly what did happen. All right. Many thought that the end of slavery would mean the end of cotton. They thought it would just be impossible to make cotton something that could be harvested with paid labor. Well, the newly freedmen wanted land and they wanted subsistence farming. However, after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, Johnson became the president, and he was on the Southerner side. So instead of the old slaves, the former slaves, getting land, the land was returned to the former owners. This was followed up with black codes and compulsory contracts. So remember the compulsory contracts we saw in England? Well, that was established in the American South. And of course, the black codes, the Jim Crow laws, uh, sort of negated the freedom that the Civil War had obtained for the former slaves. President Johnson, kind of funny, President Johnson said that Negroes must be taught that freedom means working for a wage. Well, freedom had never meant that before, but he thought the Negroes needed to be taught how to work. It's kind of funny since it had been slave labor that had built the wealth of the South. So, what the former slaves did get were sharecropping and deep debts. They got a plot of ground, but the ground was still owned by the plantation owner. He had to pay a large portion of his crop, but he also had to borrow from the landowner. And so the sharecropper could never get out of debt. And he had, because he was in debt, he had to plant the cash crop. And what was the cash crop? It was cotton. So, by 1870, more cotton was grown in the South than in 1860. All right, then we went to the phase of industrial capitalism. This is the famous movie Modern Times. Okay, cotton was the vanguard. It was the template for industrialization of every other industry. And so production now became synonymous with mass production. All production succumbs to this model. But there's a problem. Each country can saturate both its domestic and foreign markets from its own production. So this means competition becomes rivalrous, because losing the competition can mean economic collapse for the whole country. And the whole system favors nations with financial and military power. This new system required vast infrastructures, railroads, ports, administration. Information was the most important commodity, and that could only be gathered by the state, and new means of taxation. And of course, as we've seen, the disciplining of labor markets. Protectionism as a matter of survival. A growing military, so the expansion of the Royal Navy. So this is the period when you really got large standing armies that had not much to do most of the time. So war became an integral part of industrialism. Then we come to the period of finance capitalism. Oh, you know this fella. Here we have to talk about the liberation of capital. Capital is now freed from its country of origin. Banking is freed from national controls to become a global cartel. So, markets are opened up to foreign acquisition. So as we've seen, for example, in Africa, all of the important companies can actually be owned by foreigners. So the prime assets of a country fall under foreign ownership and control. Now, this new capital, freed from national boundaries, is always seeking places where the government is weak, where labor is powerful and resources are cheap. And national governments are more and more forced to cater to the financiers. And finally, we enter the stage of retail capitalism. Think of this. At its height, 600,000 workers worked in English mills. By 1963, that was down to 30,000. So the power of industrial capitalism had shrunk. American cotton is subsidized, or it would disappear. It's simply impossible to grow cotton profitably in this country anymore. My wife is from Greenville, Mississippi, and when I went out there in the 70s, of course, it was surrounded by cotton fields. Now it's surrounded by soybean fields. You can't grow cotton anymore. The bargaining power of labor has completely collapsed. Well, the most important thing now is shelf space. And these are controlled by the big box stores, Walmart, such as Walmart, and increasingly by the online retailers such as Amazon. So we have the end of stable and natural communities. So communities exist only at the pleasure of global capitalism. And if they can get something done cheaper in, say, Guatemala than they can do it in Ohio, they'll just move everything to Guatemala. Now, along with the rise of globalism, there is the rise of the liberal state. The two go hand in hand. So we're going to talk about the four pillars of liberalism, the collapse of liberalism, and the new birth of liberalism. Liberalism is based on the balance of power system. So the idea here was that each country would have huge armies. And by balancing the alliances between parties, there would be sort of a balance of terror. And that nobody would want to go to war. The second pillar was the gold standard. The idea was that the gold standard would ensure trade market order. The third pillar was the idea of self-regulating markets, or laissez-faire. And so the economy would run itself efficiently, without much hassle from the government. And finally, the liberal state. And the liberal state existed primarily to protect property. That was its major task. Under liberalism, all of social and political order is now contained within the market. Now, this is a complete reversal of what went before. The market was there to support the community. It was there to support the society. It was there to support the political order. Now it's the other way. All of those things exist only to support the market. Well, these four pillars turned out to be somewhat unreliable. The balance of power system collapses with 2 world wars. The gold standard ends up destabilizing both currencies and markets. So look at this chart. You see here, this is the period in the United States when we were under the gold standard. All right, from 1870 to 1933. The green is periods of inflation. The red is periods of deflation. Notice how wildly the currency fluctuates. Instead of stabilizing the currency, the gold standard destabilized it. Since we've got off the gold standard, we've had some periods of high inflation, although nothing like under the gold standard, and we'd have had a few periods of minor deflation. But in general, it's been much more stable. All right, laissez-faire ends up bringing nothing but misery to the workers. The liberal state simply has no means of addressing these problems. So it was replaced by the New Deal in the US and by social democracies in Western Europe and by communism in Eastern Europe. But liberalism has had a new birth. It was reborn as capitalism to become the content of conservatism in the early 20th century. And this new liberalism or capitalism became ascendant in the 1980s, beginning with Reagan in the United States and Margaret Thatcher in England. And once again, labor's bargaining power has been eroded, both through the decline of unions and through the growth of globalization, because workers in one country can be played off against workers in another country. So once again, we see the same things. A widening wealth gap between nations. So this is kind of a back to the future economy. And so labor itself is more and more contract labor, the gig economy, on-call labor, things like that. These are jobs without any security, without any benefits. Right. Let's look at the post-war world. We'll look at Bretton Woods, and we'll look at the structural adjustment programs. Bretton Woods. Okay. World War II. Well, toward the end of World War II, everybody recalled the tragedy of the Treaty of Versailles, the treaty that had imposed such sanctions on Germany and almost guaranteed a reaction which would become the Nazis and lead to another war. Plus, we were working under the threat of communism. And you have to remember, communism was popular. Now, into this situation steps John Maynard Keynes. Now, Keynes was part of the Versailles Commission that wrote the Treaty of Versailles, but he resigned from the commission when he saw what was happening. Okay? Now he was called in to do the same thing after World War II, and he devised quite a different system. So world trade would now be based on the dollar, not on gold, and there would be fixed exchange rates, which did not fluctuate up and down with the market, with the Forex market, but would be adjusted every few years. I'd have to go into the technicalities of trade to tell you why this was important. But basically, if a country does start to develop, and they do start to do well, okay, the value of their currency will go up, and their goods will get more expensive on foreign markets, and so it will negate the progress that they've made. By having fixed exchange rates rather than market exchange rates, it gives them several years to adjust to adjust their internal situation to world markets. Then you had things like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, which were going to finance the redevelopment of Europe and Japan and the development of the rest of the world. And in the United States, we had the U.S. Agency for International Development. I actually ran for a little while a brick factory in Vietnam for USAID. So on the whole, however, this was a very, very enlightened policy. I can't think of a parallel in history where the victors in such a bloody war treated the defeated with such care and concern. Well, rebuilding Europe. It was essential to get Europe rebuilt. One, as a bulwark against the communists, but two, as a trading partner. So in the United States, we had the Marshall Plan. This is what we now call foreign aid. But what the Marshall Plan was actually credits with which Europeans could buy American goods. Europeans and Japanese could buy American goods to help, so the factories, the tools, the things they needed to rebuild their economies could be bought from the American economy on credit. Of course, the problem in Europe and Japan, of course, is that they were industrial countries that had simply been bombed flat. So the credits to buy American goods allowed them to rebuild. And they had a very quick recovery. Always, you'll hear it labeled an economic miracle, and it was. Well, would this be a model for the developing world? Or did the developing world present a different kind of problem and a different kind of challenge altogether? All right, now we come to third world aid. This is going to be different from the aid for Europe or Japan. This went through three phases. The first phase is called instant Westernization. The second was the human development phase. And the third, the one we're in now, is the structural adjustment programs. Talking about development, the primary economic formula that is used today is called the Kuznets Curve. The Kuznets Curve looks like this. You'll notice here's inequality and here's income per capita over time. So what the Kuznets Curve says is that inequality will start low, but then as the country gets developed, things will actually get worse. Then at some magic point, things will turn around and start to get better. You see that? So, you develop a country, things get worse. At some point, who knows when, everything gets better, right? Okay. Now, Simon Kuznets was a very, very careful statistician. As a matter of fact, all the statistics we use today, if you look at GDP, if you look at labor rate, unemployment rate, all of that stuff, all of that was developed by Simon Kuznets in the 40s. Okay? But when it comes to the development, he really couldn't find a measure. And he himself said that the Kuznets curve was based on 5% of data and 95% speculation, all tainted by wishful thinking. And he was right. There is no validity to the Kuznets curve. Successful development always shows a downward slope. It always looks like this. So inequality starts high and shrinks. That's development. That was development in Taiwan, Japan, Germany, France, wherever, any country that actually successfully got developed had a curve that looked like this, not like this. So, nevertheless, despite the lack of a single successful example, the Kuznets curve remains dogmatic in development economics. All right, now let's talk about these three phases with that behind us. Instant Westernization. Here was the idea. You'd build hydroelectric dams, international airports, Western-style highways and freeways, that sort of thing. Okay? Well, it's a little doubtful that developing countries actually needed these things. They had high debts, but they had very little income, very little value. So there was no way to service these debts. Further, they tended to disrupt local economic arrangements. So you'll read in the book about the development of the Akasomba Dam, which displaced whole tribes and displaced economies that had been successful for hundreds and hundreds of years. But what all of these projects did do is they enriched a select elite at public expense. So in each country was being created this highly westernized elite, that was more and more divorced from the concerns of its own country. The dams, for example, displaced 10 million people, which led to tribal warfare. uh, all over Africa because the displaced people had nowhere to go. And we got this phase of human development. This is the tree hugger phase. This was the feel-good phase. This lasted from 1968 to the 1980s. So the idea is that, we'd have clinics with birth control, and schools for education, and they'd have birth control, and they'd dig some wells, and they'd have birth control, and some local highway projects, and then they'd have birth control, and let's see. Oh yeah, did I mention birth control? Well, it turned out all of these feel-good stuff was more expensive than hydroelectric dams and had very, very little impact. Well, then comes the structural adjustment programs. The LDCs, the less developed countries, which became the term of art for the Third World, could not service all these debts from the World Bank and the IMF. But the IMF and the World Bank, out of the goodness of their heart, imposed conditions for rescheduling the debts. And these conditions required these countries to follow pure free market principles. So this period is called free market evangelization. So what are some of these conditions? Well, they had to have balanced budgets. They were to be confined to resource extraction. So they would mine the copper or the aluminum, but somebody else would process it. Trade was to be liberalized. That is, they were to drop any tariff protections that they had. The currencies were to be devalued. So there was the end of Bretton Woods. Any government-owned businesses were to be privatized. They were to open their stock markets so foreigners could buy up their companies. They were to provide labor market flexibility. Now, this is a term of art, meaning they had to outlaw unions and strikes. And they were to cut social programs. Okay, the hypocrisy of this is astounding. For example, they had to balance their budgets. When's the last time you saw a balanced budget in the United States? Not since Clinton, which is probably before all of you were born. We are certainly not confined to resource extraction or trade liberalization, etc., etc. In other words, we're imposing conditions on these countries that we ourselves could never meet. Well, the policy failed. Okay, growth stagnated. You had economic disasters, such as in Argentina. One night, the people of Buenos Aires noticed something rather strange. There was a long line of armored cars going to the airport. Well, that's something you don't see every day. The next morning, it was announced that all bank accounts were frozen. So you couldn't write a check, you couldn't take money out of your account, you couldn't use the ATM. But the wealthy had been warned the night before and immediately withdrew their funds and shipped everything to Spain. So this has led to increased instability and loss of ownership, of national ownership of the assets of that country, of each country. So here's the chart I showed you earlier. So Africa was freed politically, but it was still dependent economically. It's just neo-colonialism. It's just the old system in a new form. Why did it fail? Well, maybe it was designed to fail. Maybe it didn't fail at all. Maybe it worked. The market is a necessary condition for development, but it is not a sufficient one. No country ever developed on pure free market principles. So, the structural adjustment programs enforced a doctrine that had rarely been tried and had never worked. Oddly enough, the countries which prospered all rejected these doctrines. So China, if you compare, say, the cases of China and Russia, Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union, China in its conversion to a more capitalist state, they didn't follow anything like what the West was pushing through the World Bank and the IMF. Russia did, and Russia had nothing but problems, which led to the rise of Vladimir Putin, a former KGB agent. Okay, so that's the situation with globalization. Let's talk about trade and development. We'll talk about the telos of trade, the trade cycle, free trade versus fair trade, and finally, integral human development. To think about trade, you have to think about the universal destination of goods. Under the universal destination of goods, as we've learned, the gifts of the earth are meant for all. But they are not evenly distributed. So some regions have more gold, some have more oil, some have vast wheat fields, some have grand fisheries, etc., etc., etc. Only trade makes the gifts of the earth available to everybody. Autarky, that is, self-sufficiency, is neither possible nor desirable. So no country can be self-sufficient unless it's at a very, very crude and low level. Man was made for trade. But trade, like all human relations, must be governed by justice. So, let me offer this as the telos of trade, to make the gifts of God available to all under justice. The economic benefits of trade are obvious. First, it fulfills the universal destination of goods. That's not only a moral good, that's an economic good. It enhances economic diversity. So we can get goods from all over the world today, and we can work with the whole world today. So it should lead to more stability and to a greater range of goods. And wider markets can mean more efficient production. And there are social and political benefits. There are greater employment opportunities for everybody in all countries. And there's a constituency for peace. So if you're trading with a country, it doesn't matter what disputes are between those two countries. You are an agent for peace. You don't want to go to war with your trading partner and cut off your trade. So you become part of that constituency for peace. There's a broadening of culture. After all, if you're going to trade with France or with China or with Africa, you're going to have to learn something about them. So culture is broadened. Let me give you a rather dramatic example of that. Of course, everybody at the University of Dallas has read Aristotle, and everybody at the University of Dallas is familiar with the scholastics, particularly Thomas Aquinas, who rooted their work in Aristotle. Well, the plain fact of the matter is Aristotle had been lost to the Latin West. You will never see him quoted in the Church Fathers. You won't find him at the university level or any place else in the West until he is brought in through trade with the Arabs. And in fact, Thomas Aquinas's commentaries, sources for Aristotle, are Ibn al-Rushdi and Ibn al-Sena, known by their Latin names of Averroes and Avicenna. So he is highly dependent upon Muslim commentaries. This doesn't happen without trade with the Arabs. So you get a spread of learning. If you're going to learn to trade with the Arabs or the Chinese, you might want to learn some Arabic or some Chinese. But trade can be perverted. That is, it's perverted by violating its telos, the universal destination of goods under justice. So to have justice, you must have fair values on both sides. This means, I think, that a living wage appropriate to each culture. Now, a living wage in Guatemala or in Bangladesh or in Indonesia is not going to be the same as a living wage in Dallas, Texas. So each country will still have, these less developed countries will still have a trading advantage. But we still need to pay their people, pay enough so that their people can be paid a living wage according to the standards of their country. Now, without this, so without justice, these countries cannot develop internal markets, because the internal markets are always dependent upon the level of demand at the lower levels of society, not at the upper levels. So the better the wages are at the bottom, the more demand there is for goods in that country and the more opportunities for investment there is in that country. So without decent wages, then you get you can't develop internal markets in the developing countries, and that's the whole purpose of trade and development. Justice tends toward balanced trade by building up the workers in both countries. When the workers in both countries are built up, are raised, they become trading partners. But trade can become a tool of oppression, again because of the violation of its telos, justice in the wage. Workers end up competing against each other for a subsistence wage. So if things can be easily moved out of one country to another to take advantage of a lower wage, you really don't have trade at all. What you have is an arbitrage of labor rates. So and you have a breaking of worker solidarity. What this does is it ends up importing poverty. So we outsource all our work, now our workers don't have work. It lowers the wealth and well-being in both countries. We lose our manufacturing base. We forget how to make things. Both countries end up sinking into debt. Trade can be an exercise of political and economic control. So instead of mutual benefit, it seeks control of resources and trade routes. It seeks political and financial control of nations. It increases, injustice increases pressure to emigrate. So after we've sort of degraded a country, then we notice all of a sudden all their people are showing up at our borders. Gee whiz, how did that happen? So competition, but then the competition for jobs creates the fear of immigrants. And you get into situations like Iraq and the Middle East. So we managed to, through our wars, to destroy everything in the Middle East, and all of a sudden, millions of Middle Eastern migrants are showing up in Europe. This also leads to this war party mentality. We have this feeling that we're surrounded by dangers and we've got to increase our military budgets. We've got to get involved in more wars, etc., etc. Let's talk about the trade cycle. Let's talk about how trade is supposed to work. All trade begins in cities, and it begins with the initial wealth of the countryside. So there's some wealth in the countryside. So whatever it might be. There might be farmlands, there might be fisheries, there might be mines, whatever it is, okay? The countryside produces something. This is brought to cities to be processed for shipment. So the national economy actually equals the sum of its cities' economies. Now, with the proceeds of this initial wealth, they bring in imports. Now, here's the key step. If this step doesn't happen, there will be no development of the country. Called import substitution. What you do is you start importing goods and then think of ways you can produce them locally. Usually starting off with cheap knockoffs, and then getting better and better at it. Now, producing these imported goods locally now increases the exports. Okay, so you're going to import high quality goods from another country, learn how to make it knockoffs cheaply, and then you can export those to regions which are less developed than yourself. Now this enriches the business life of the city, okay, because now they're making more products. But paradoxically, it also increases imports. This sounds kind of paradoxical. By making cheap knockoffs of things you were importing, you actually increase imports. Why? Because now you have more money to buy more imports. All right. We looked at the example of Taiwan, going from cheap toys to an industrial powerhouse just like that. That's the way it was done. Import substitution. We have to look at the trade cycle. All right? So you start with the real wealth of the region, whatever it might be. This then is exported to regions which have a lack. And with the funds from the exports, you have imports. Then you learn how to make these imported products yourself. So you have import substitution, which produces more real wealth. You see how that works? Let me give you some examples. Venice. Everybody here has been to Venice, I do believe. Well, Venice starts out as a city, as a bunch of ragged refugees living on sticks, literally, in the middle of a lagoon. But it learns to gather up the produce from the surrounding countryside to become a supply region for Constantinople. Now they start importing goods from Constantinople and then learn to make those goods for themselves. So they followed the trade cycle. And where did they follow it to? They followed it to becoming the most important city of the Renaissance. And to building that Piazza San Marco, which you all went to. All based on trade. Look at another example, a negative example, Uruguay. It became rich on its cattle wealth. But they did not do import substitution. They imported a lot of luxury goods and were content to keep importing them. Well, what happened? Turns out, I don't want to offend any ranchers here, but anybody can learn how to raise a cow. It ain't that difficult. Soon Uruguay loses its position and it ends up in poverty. Right, let's talk about free trade versus fair trade. Often the solution advanced is protectionism. That's tariffs to keep goods out or to make them more expensive than your own. Well, I'm thinking that if trade is not the problem, protection is not the answer, because that impedes the universal destination of goods, and it harms solidarity. That being said, however, in certain cases, tariffs can be a useful short-term tool. We'll talk about free trade. This is an abstract theory that subordinates society to the market. It depends on the conditions of comparative advantage, that is, balanced trade, full employment of all resources in both countries, the immobility of capital. But those things never happen. Never. So it's a perfect theory without any actual application. And it involves a lot of hypocrisy. Okay, we call them free trade agreements. In fact, they're not. They're very, very thick documents which dictate the terms of trade between two countries. So even the term free trade it really doesn't happen. And it always turns out that countries without bargaining power end up getting shafted. All right, fair trade. Adam Smith had who was an advocate of free trade, nevertheless had three exceptions. National defense industries. Well, certainly that makes sense. It doesn't matter whether China can make warplanes better than you can, cheaper than you can make them. You still don't want to outsource your aircraft industry to the Chinese. Reciprocal tariffs. This is trade war. So if a country raises a tariff on your good, you can raise a tariff on their good. And adjustment for regulations. Now, this third one is very important because a lot of companies move out, not just because of wages, but sometimes even more importantly, because regulations, especially environmental regulations. So if they have to clean up the water that they use in processing chemicals, clean it up before they return it to the river, this can be very expensive. And if another country will allow them to get away without doing that, then they might be tempted to move there. Well, the difference in costs can be tariffed. So if they're saving X number of dollars, you put an X number of dollars tariff on their goods. And it removes their incentive to move for that reason. So you can impose the same safety and environmental standards on imports and then adjust them with tariffs. So if they don't follow those standards, we'd have to follow here, put a tariff on them, equal to the cost of what it would cost them to follow those standards. I think also we can talk about the differential just wage. So what do I mean? So suppose a wage for a certain kind of work, say seamstress in Bangladesh, is 50 cents a day. But a living wage would be, say, $1 a day or $1.50 a day. All right. So we can put a tariff on equal to the difference in what it would cost with and without the just wage. And that would mean exporters would have the choice of either paying their workers or paying us. You see? So we can use, I think, under the terms of fair trade, we can use tariffs in that way. So we want to ensure that a just wage appropriate to that society is paid in every country. This, moreover, is an expression of worker solidarity. What we have in the world right now is financier solidarity. We have elite solidarities. The elites in each country are more united with each other than they are with the people down the street. So the elites from an oil executive in Nigeria, a a cocoa magnate in Ghana, a prince in Saudi Arabia. They all are more united with each other than they are united with the people in their own country. They all shop together in Paris. They vacation together in Switzerland. They hold power lunches in London, and they buy apartments in Trump Towers in New York. They're united with each other, while the workers, the solidarity of the workers is broken because they're competing against each other. So I think this idea of the just wage, international just wage, is frankly the key to the question. So, the virtuous cycle. Economies are built from the bottom up, not the top down. Demand precedes supply. Nobody invests anywhere unless there is a funded demand. Now, helping foreign labor makes their internal markets grow, which increases the demand for labor in that country. Soon, wages rise high enough that they can afford to buy stuff from us. So this is the principle of solidarity. By raising up others, we raise up ourselves, and we stabilize the world economy. This is at the base of the idea of integral human development. Trade should build up the family, should build up the community, should build up the nation. Never tear it down. And along with this capital solidarity, there should be worker solidarity. And capital should not be able to play the workers in one country off against the workers in another country. This is not just good theology. This is good economics. Okay. So, how shall we look at this thesis? What questions can we pose here? Well, one question we can ask is, does trade really have a telos? What do you think? We can ask, does globalization break worker solidarity? And your questions and critiques. I would very much like to hear that. So think about these questions, and think about your own questions and critiques, and bring them to the discussion group, and we'll put them on the discussion board. Okay, I shall see you all. I shall see you all shortly, and hopefully we'll have a very good discussion this week.